So this is the masthead of William Lloyd Garrison's original abolitionist newspaper, but it's colorized because it's the Liberator dot today. In the middle of the uproar over family separation at the border, my friend Ed Brown sent me this week this G.K. Chesterton quotation. Hope is the power of being cheerful in circumstances we know to be desperate. I don't know if Jonathon, King Saul's son, was cheerful or not, but the circumstances depicted in 1 Samuel chapter 14 were mind-bogglingly desperate. Let's consider Jonathon's statement of hope. Perhaps the Lord will help us. My name is Lowell Bliss. Welcome to episode 24 of the Liberator Today's video series on hope. Consider the prospects for Jonathon and the Israelite army as they face their foe, the Philistines. It is the picture of abject desperation. King Saul has raised an army of 3,000 select troops, and he has won one quick battle against a garrison of Philistines. But then the Philistines muster and bring against the Israelites 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and, quote, as many warriors as the grains of sand on the seashore. We read, quote, the men of Israel saw what a tight spot they were in, and because they were hard pressed by the enemy, they tried to hide in caves, thickets, rocks, holes, and cisterns. Some of them crossed the Jordan River and escaped into the land of Gad and Gilead. By the time all the demoralized deserters had fled, Saul counted his men and found only 600 left. 600 against more of the enemy than could be counted. 1 Samuel 13:7 says, meanwhile Saul stayed at Gilgal, and his men were trembling with fear. But it doesn't end there. Listen to this. There were no blacksmiths in the land of Israel in those days. The Philistines wouldn't allow them, for fear they would make swords and spears for the Hebrews. So on the day of the battle, none of the people of Israel had a sword or spear except for Saul and Jonathon. Additionally, the Philistines had the high ground, the pass at Michmash. So Saul and Jonathon, 598 weaponless and fearful men against a Philistine horde who held the high ground. Does that feel like a metaphor for any situation that you've ever been in? But at least the Israelites have God, right? Well, we've forgotten to consider an incident, and 6 verses plopped in the middle of 1 Samuel 13. Saul grows impatient in his fear, and rather than wait for the prophet Samuel, he himself offers burnt offerings to Yahweh in violation of the law. He tries to explain to Samuel that he has a perfectly good reason for what he did, but Samuel exclaims, how foolish! You have not kept the command of the Lord that the Lord your God gave you. Had you kept it, the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom must end. In chapter 14 we read, one day Jonathon said to his armor bearer, come, let's go up over to where the Philistines have their outpost. Jonathon is about to do something remarkable, something full of hope. He's going to imagine an alternative possibility for the future, for his future and for Israel's future, alternative to what the data indicates. We have said that hope's alternative future is in and through a good, free, and sovereign God. But for Jonathon, that very God has just pronounced judgment. There appears to be no future for his father's dynasty, and by implication for him as heir apparent. God has appointed a new leader for his people, and it's not Jonathon. So now it is not 600 men going up against the Philistines, it's only 2, and they ostensibly have no future. They proactively go out to the very heart of their problem. They climb up between 2 cliffs called Bozez and Senna, which means sunny and thorny, so quite likely the climb was exposed and rigorous. Jonathon turns to his armor bearer and says, let's go across to the outpost of those pagans. Perhaps the Lord will help us. For nothing can hinder the Lord. He can win a battle whether he has many warriors or only a few. We'll stop for a moment and consider the armor bearer's response. He says, do what you think is best. I'm with you completely, whatever you decide. Let's stop and thank God for our incredible friends who loyally stay with us in desperate situations. Jonathon's full statement has 3 elements that can become a formula of hope for us in desperate situations. Number 1, he takes a bold step of action toward, not away from his problems. Let's go across to the outpost of those pagans, he says. Second, he makes a bold statement of conviction, what we call hope. Perhaps the Lord will help us. And then thirdly, he rehearses his rationale. And notice it has nothing to do with the data, the circumstances, about which he can muster no optimism. Instead, it has everything to do with the character of God. Jonathon says, "For nothing can hinder the Lord. He can win a battle whether he has many warriors or only a few." At this point, who is Jonathon talking to? With whom is he rehearsing God's goodness, freedom, and sovereignty? Obviously, he's talking to his armor bearer, trying to bolster his courage, and I suspect he's also trying to allay his own fears as well. But when we get around to studying Jacques Allou's book, Hope in Time of Abandonment, Allou would argue that hope speaks directly to God and reminds God of who he is and what he has promised. In Jonathon's statement, we can see him invoke God's sovereignty in the faith that nothing can hinder the Lord. He invokes God's goodness in the word help. And most interestingly, we see God's freedom in the word perhaps. God is not bound by our circumstances, by overwhelming odds against us, by the dictates of the king, nor even by his own pronouncements, in the sense that God is free to change his mind, to grant reprieves, or to delay his judgment for a season. With the good, free, and sovereign God, we are always allowed to say, perhaps the Lord will help. The end of the story is that Jonathon acts experimentally with God. His plan is that when they show themselves to the Philistines, if they are told, stay there, they will stay. But if they are told to come up and fight, then they will go. Jonathon says, quote, "But if they say, come up and fight, then we will go up. That will be the Lord's sign that he will help us defeat them." I have no idea how Jonathon could identify that as a sign. Maybe it was part of the help already. That although part of an accursed dynasty, the Lord would speak to him and give him faith to believe. They do go up, immediately kill 20 of the enemy, and then we read, suddenly panic broke out in the Philistine army, both in the camp and in the field, including the outposts and the raiding parties. And just then an earthquake struck, and everyone was terrified. Saul and the Israelites, including many hiding away, include many who had joined the Philistine army, believe it or not. Down in the encampment, they see something happening, they join the fray. Final verse of chapter 14, "So the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle continued to rage even beyond Bethaven." To summarize, what does hope made practical look like in a desperate situation? Number 1, genuinely move toward your troubles, not away from them. Number 2, declare your hope out loud. Perhaps the Lord will help us. And number 3, before God and all witnesses, rehearse the goodness, freedom, and sovereignty of God. The alternative is to hide down in the holes in the cisterns with Saul and the fearful. That's no way to live or die, regardless of how the good, free, and sovereign God may decide. I'm Lowell Bliss, environmental missionary and climate activist. Thank you for visiting the Liberator today.